Hello and welcome to this video on efficiency. In this video we're going to look at what efficiency means and how it's measured, how efficiency can be improved, and then finally look at the difference between labour intensive and capital intensive methods of production. Let's start off with efficiency. If a business is efficiently using its resources, then we would say that the business is able to produce at a low cost in terms of its resources. So efficiency exists when a business is producing products at the lowest cost per unit. Why is this important for a business? Well, if a business is producing more efficiently, has a lower cost per unit, then it will produce goods at a lower cost than competitors, giving it a competitive advantage and improving its competitiveness. Also, if products are cheaper to produce, the business is more efficient and has a lower cost per unit, then they can generate more profit, and they also may be able to maintain their profits at lower prices if they're reducing their costs per unit at the same time. Finally, being efficient is a good way to maximize the return on any assets that the business has bought. If they've bought new equipment or factory buildings and are then able to operate at a low cost per unit, then it's likely going to make a maximum return to recover the money they've made investing. There is a direct relationship here between productivity and costs. As a business becomes more productive, its output per worker or per unit of time or output per input increases. This should lower the average cost per unit. If you're faster making products, you can make more in the same time, being paid the same amount, so the cost per unit should fall over time. So there's an inverse relationship here between productivity and the cost. As the costs fall, the business gets more efficient. So looking at average cost is a good way of measuring efficiency, and sometimes we call the average cost per unit the unit cost, the cost per unit, and we calculate this by taking the total production costs in a given period and dividing by the total output, the total number of units produced in a given period. This is an important formula and you should take it down in your notes. So let's have a look at this diagram. On this axis here we can see the average cost per unit, so a high average cost per unit, and down here a very cheap average cost per unit, and along the bottom, the x-axis, we can see the number of units that are being produced. So what this shows us here is as more units are being produced, the average cost is starting to fall until we get to 300 units produced, and beyond 300 units produced, the average cost of producing each unit is starting to rise. So what would we say about the efficiency of this business? Where is it the most efficient? Where is it becoming more efficient? Where is it becoming less efficient? Well, as average costs are falling, becoming lower, we would say the business is becoming more efficient. At 300 units produced, it reaches its most efficient point, it has its lowest average cost, but beyond 300, as it produces more, the average costs start to rise, and so where we have rising average costs, we would say the business is becoming less efficient. So we can use average cost and unit cost to measure how efficient a business is, and also use that to make comparisons between businesses. Here we have 5 businesses, A to E. We have the units produced, and we have the total cost of producing those units. And so which of these 5 businesses would we say is the most efficient? Which has the lowest unit costs? You can pause the video now, have a quick go at the calculations, and see which business is the most efficient. Well, performing the calculation of total costs divided by total output, we get the following unit costs. And from that we can make a comparison and say that D is the most efficient business because it has the lowest unit cost. Perhaps because it produces the most units. And we'll look at that concept next. How might a business improve its efficiency? Well, through training. If its staff can work quicker or more effectively, then they can produce more for the same cost. Maybe if they're more motivated, they produce more for the same cost. If they have better equipment, or they have more equipment, or if they have better quality raw materials, or if they're improved in the way in which they organize production so that they're less wasteful, this will reduce costs, and so the unit cost will improve. The next we're going to look at is how costs are likely to change with output. So if we consider an example here where fixed costs for our business are £10,000 and the variable costs are £100 per unit, what would our total costs look like? Well, this table here shows us as we increase the number of units that we make, the fixed costs stay the same, the variable costs begin to rise because they vary with the number of units we make. The fixed and the variable together gives us total cost, and total cost divided by output tells us the cost per unit. And if you study the cost per unit column here, what you can see is that as we produce more units, the cost per unit, the unit cost or the average cost per unit, starts to fall. So at 50 units it's £300 per unit, at 250 units it's £140 per unit. And this is quite a common concept, that as we produce more, the costs begin to fall per unit. And we call this economies of scale. So take this definition down in your notes. Economies of scale arise when unit costs fall as output increases. So if we consider an example here, when 10 units are made, the cost might be £2 per unit, but as we scale up and buy in bulk, for example, 50 units are at a cost of £1.50 per unit. If we produce even more, 100 units, even more bulk buying and better deals, then the cost falls to £1 per unit. So as the output rises, the unit cost falls. We call that economies of scale, and many businesses benefit from this as they grow. This graph shows us the same concept. So average cost per unit on this axis and the number of units produced on the x-axis. And we can see as we produce more, go from Q1 to Q2 quantity, the average cost falls, so we're benefiting from economies of scale. Quantity 3 is our most efficient point, the lowest average cost, so we're benefiting the most we can do from economies of scale at this point. As we go beyond Q3, and actually average costs start to rise, as we produce even more, average costs rise. This is no longer economies of scale, we call this diseconomies of scale, when average costs start to rise as output increases. So we've looked at efficiency and how it's measured through unit cost. We've looked at how efficiency can be improved. The last topic here is what is the difference between labour intensive and capital intensive production. Labour intensive production is production that relies on using a lot of workers, people, whereas capital intensive production is production that relies on using lots of machinery and technology. Once we've taken these definitions down, let's move on. So some examples. Can you think of any examples of industries that use lots of people and not much technology? And also, can you think of any capital intensive industries that use lots of machinery and tools and so on, but not many people? Well, these might be some examples. Labour intensive industries would be things like hotels and restaurants. It's mainly the staff who operate and provide the service. Or hairdressing would be a good example. Whereas capital intensive industries that use mainly machinery and technology would be things like oil mining or extraction and refining, possibly car manufacturing if there's a lot of robotics involved. Transport would be another example of where the machinery provides the large part of the service or the good. So let's think of some implications then for our business of labour intensive production. Well, labour intensive production will mean that labour costs are higher than capital costs, so the costs will be mainly variable costs, which implies a lower break-even output. And firms will mostly benefit if they can access large sources of low-cost labour. This maybe applies to particularly businesses in the developing world where there is lots of low-cost labour to be found. If we think of capital-intensive industries, what does this mean for our business? Well, capital costs are the highest, higher than labour costs. The costs will be mainly fixed, which implies a higher break-even output. Instead of having access to low-cost labour, firms benefit most if they can access low-cost long-term financing. So large loans at cheap rates enables them to buy the machinery that they need to operate their business. So what are the advantages and drawbacks of capital-intensive production using lots of machinery and tools? Well, some of the benefits are there are greater opportunities for economies of scale. You can produce at very large scale, and as a result, maybe your machines can be more productive, operate 24/7, things like that. Some drawbacks, well, if you're going to buy all this machinery, then that's a significant investment, so a large amount of money might be needed up front. If your machinery becomes obsolete, it gets replaced by someone or something better, then that may have large implications for your business survival. Now let's look at some of the benefits and drawbacks of labour-intensive production. Well, benefits, if the costs are low, because you're operating in a low-wage location, then the unit costs may still be quite low. Labour is a very flexible resource, whereas a machine will generally do one particular job very well. Labour can be retrained and maybe have many skills, and so it can be more flexible in terms of meeting customer requirements or demand. Some potential drawbacks, well, there may be problems with the employee-employer relationship, issues perhaps with unions or working conditions. If you lose your staff, they move to another business, then that could be an issue, and you need to invest in their training. They won't be able to do the job perfectly from day one in many circumstances. So, in this video we've looked at efficiency, how it's measured, how it can be improved, and then lastly we've looked at the difference between labour-intensive production and capital-intensive production. That's it.